Chapter 9. Chapter 9 continues and concludes the narrative begun in chapter 8. In this chapter, Jesus heals, calls Matthew, also called Levi, his Hebrew name in Luke's Gospel 5:27, teaches about fasting, restores a girl to life, heals a woman with a hemorrhage, heals two blind men, and casts out a demon. The person Jesus heals first in chapter 9 is a paralytic. Before healing the paralytic's physical condition, Jesus forgives the paralytic's sins, an action proper only to God. By so doing, despite the scribes' protests, Jesus asserts his divinity and, as Hahn comments, indicates that spiritual illness caused by sin is a more serious illness than physical illness. Physical illness providentially exists, continues Hahn, to disclose to us the dimensions of spiritual illness caused by sin. Awareness of the ordering of physical illness to spiritual illness, Jesus encourages us, states Hahn, to long for more than physical healing. Later, when Jesus calls Matthew the tax collector to be his disciple and shares a meal with tax collectors and sinners, the Pharisees object to Jesus' close presence to those deemed as sick with sin, a spiritually contagious reality. Instead of separating himself from sinners, as the Pharisees did, Jesus remains with the sinners. By not becoming sinful as the sinners, but rather inviting them to lead a holy life by following him, which some do, Jesus teaches that the Pharisees' understanding of holiness as separation may be a necessary beginning step in growing in holiness by avoiding near occasions of sin. But it is not the fullness of holiness which Jesus embodies. The Pharisees' bracketing of holiness from sin and impurity is a common understanding of the holy as separate from sin and not intermingled with sin, and yet Jesus, writes Father Menard, is holy and was the friend of sinners. He is all purity and allowed the prostitutes to touch him and to love him. He loudly condemned the rich and ate with them. My disconcerting God is difficult for the man who wants to measure him completely, or for those who want to impose a logic upon him. But my God escapes all logic and all measures. Writing a similar vein of thought, Benedict XVI identifies the Pharisees' understanding of holiness as separate from what is impure and unholy with the common understanding of holiness regardless of historical context. I quote, "In the human dream of a perfect world, holiness is always visualized as untouchability by sin and evil, as something unmixed with the latter. There always remains in some form or other a tendency to think in terms of black and white, a tendency to cut out and reject mercilessly the current form of the negative, which can be conceived in widely varying terms. In contemporary criticism of society and in the actions in which it vents itself, this relentless side, always present in human ideals, is once again only too evident. For this reason, Jesus' holiness can be upsetting, since it is absent of a condemnatory note. Fire did not fall on the unworthy, as Benedict XVI states, nor were the zealous allowed to pull up the weeds they saw growing luxuriantly on all sides. On the contrary, continues Benedict XVI, this holiness expressed itself precisely as mingling with the sinners whom Jesus drew into his vicinity, as mingling to the point where he himself was made to be sin and bore the curse of the law in execution as a criminal, complete community of fate with the lost. He has drawn sin to himself, made it his lot, and so revealed what true holiness is, not separation, but union, not judgment, but redeeming love. At Jesus Christ's presence, extended through time, the church is, I quote, simply the continuation of God's deliberate plunge into human wretchedness. Is she not simply the continuation of Jesus' habit of sitting at table with sinners, of his mingling with the misery of sin to the point where he actually seems to sink under its weight? Is there not revealed in the unholy holiness of the church, as opposed to man's expectation of purity, God's true holiness, which is love, love that does not keep its distance in a sort of aristocratic, untouchable purity, but mixes with the dirt of the world, in order thus to overcome it? Can therefore the holiness of the church be anything else but the bearing with one another that comes, of course, from the fact that all of us are borne up by Christ? I must admit that to me, this unholy holiness of the church has in itself something infinitely comforting about it. Would one not be bound to despair in face of a holiness that was spotless and could only operate on us by judging us and consuming us by fire? The place where Jesus healed the sick in chapter 9 is an interpretive context, further comments Hahn. According to chapter 4, Jesus left Nazareth and went and dwelt in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. Matthew 5:13. This region is within the territory of the former northern kingdom of Israel, which in 722 BC was conquered by the Assyrian Empire and its people deported. The northern tribes never regained their identity as tribes, unlike Judah in the south, which was able to regain their identity after they returned from their 586 BC exile. Hosea, whom Jesus quotes in responding to the Pharisees, describes the northern tribe of Israel as like a dove who will go to Assyria. In Hebrew, the word dove is Jonah, the name of Jonah the prophet, who was sent by God to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians, to preach a message of repentance. As a new Jonah is a new kind of dove, Jesus is sent to the former territory of northern kingdom of Israel to restore all of Israel, all 12 tribes, as the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and not just to strengthen the existing southern tribe of Judah. Those considered lost, whether the northern tribe, the physically sick, or tax collectors, like Matthew, are especially beloved by Jesus and sought by Jesus in the gospel. According to Father Bernard, I quote, God does not necessarily limit his choices and gifts to those with qualities and natural talents. Not as man sees does God see, because man sees the appearance, but the Lord looks into the heart. This is how God spoke to Samuel concerning the choice he made of David, who was preferred to his older brothers. This is God's usual policy. He chooses what is not. He disassociates holiness from human grandeur. In a frail creature or someone poorly gifted, in the most modest of conditions, in the most obscure existence, God can show the magnificence of his grace, sometimes during this life before the death of the ones chosen by him, but more often after the death, when he has brought the ones molded by him in secret into the next world. Jesus' deliberate association with the marginalized contrasts with the Pharisees' conscious avoidance of such people. This difference does not mean that, because Jesus differed from the Pharisees in their tradition, he was opposed to tradition or was a revolutionary. Rather, comments Benedict XVI, Jesus cannot be classified either as a revolutionary or as a traditionalist, since, I quote, Jesus wants to lead us to know the Father from the perspective of tradition and to understand tradition from the perspective of the Father. His constant prayerful reliance on his Father explain why at times Jesus appears to be strict on fidelity to tradition, and other times to be free from certain traditions, for both his freedom and his strictness proceed from a common source. I'm quoting, from his prayerful intercourse with the Father, from his personal knowledge of God, on the basis of which he draws the dividing line between center and periphery, between the will of God and the work of man. A reference to the complementary relationship between the two Old Testament prophets, Hosea and Haggai, helps clarify why Jesus exhibited freedom from certain traditions while remaining strict on others. In rebuking the Pharisees and their hypocritical worship, Jesus quotes from Hosea, an 8th century BC northern prophet who prophesied centuries before the Babylonian invasion and destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and before the Assyrian conquest of Israel. Hosea was inspired to challenge the Jewish people to purify their liturgical prayers by ceasing to look holy in public prayer while oppressing the poor and marginalized. In contrast, but in a complementary manner, Haggai was a 6th century BC southern minor prophet who prophesied to the Jewish people after they had returned from the Babylonian exile. His name, which is based on the Jewish word for celebration, Chag, indicates what he was inspired to emphasize. After returning from the Babylonian exile, the Jewish people had lost much of the liturgical and communal practices of prayer. Rather than condemning hypocritical worship as the earlier prophet Hosea had, Haggai encouraged the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple and public worship, for this was at risk of being lost even though the Jewish people had returned home. Jesus is both free and strict in his living out of tradition, since as the fullness of revelation he encompasses both the truth God inspired through Hosea and the truth that God inspired through Haggai. The church as a new Israel is to engage in public liturgical worship, as encouraged by Haggai, but not to be excused from love of and care for the poor and marginalized, hypocrisy that Hosea condemned. In quoting Hosea to the Pharisees, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice," Jesus is, like Hosea, speaking hyperbolically, a common Semitic way of emphasizing a point by exaggerating the point. As explained by the Old Testament scholar Jill Levine, Hosea's verse does not mean, "I want this instead of that," but rather, I quote, "This is more important than that." In the spirit of Jesus' fullness of truth, Father Menard both teaches the centrality of the Mass and the importance of liturgical and personal prayer, as Haggai did, while also warning against hypocritical worship and prayer, as Hosea did. In commenting on Jesus from the perspective of Hosea's concern with hypocritical worship, Father Menard writes, I quote, "God the Father wants us all to be and live as brothers and sisters. Brotherhood is the first property that the life of the believer must have. A countersign to fraternity is an alienating religion that forgets the fraternal love for an exclusive dedication to ceremonies and rites and an eager, perhaps selfish, eagerness to please God, to achieve one's own individual salvation without worrying about the brothers. Christ all throughout his life gave irrefutable evidence of his preference for man, postponing the Sabbath, the temple, and ritual sacrifices, thus becoming a creditor to the accusations of ungodly and blasphemies, and partly provoking his own death condemnation. We cannot please God if we do not love our brothers and sisters. Imagine a mother entrusts her eldest son to take her little brother for a walk. And when he returns, the oldest brother has lost his little brother. The disgust at home is huge. The will of the parents is for all the brothers to return home, that the older brother would not let go of his hand to his younger brother. And this is the sadness of our Father, God, who asked Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" We let the brother get lost and spend our time trying to please God with spectacular solemnities and ceremonies, but it's useless. As long as we don't find our brother, God will not be happy. You can't be a good son if you are not a good brother. Jesus' later reference in verse 15 to himself as the bridegroom relates to his reference to Isaiah's insistence that God desires mercy and not sacrifice. As explained by Hahn, this is because right in the beginning of his preaching, Hosea prophesied a time when Israel would be restored by God as a holy people, as sons of the living God. Jesus is a bridegroom in accordance with the Old Testament's depiction of God as Israel's faithful bridegroom, who will gather people into a new restored Israel, and with King David's and his heirs' identification as a bridegroom of Israel. Jesus' healings are best understood in the context of his identity as the bridegroom, Davidic king, and Messiah. Jesus heals, rules, and saves as a lover, indicated by his role of bridegroom. For this reason, comments Hahn, after Jesus restores the sight to two blind men who identify Jesus with the royal messianic title of Son of David, he sternly charged them, "See that no one knows it." As the perfect lover, Jesus ordered the healed men to not tell anyone, so that the men would know that Jesus healed them not for public acclaim, but rather because Jesus loved the blind men for their own sake as an end in themselves, and his grace as an end in itself, since created grace establishes and deepens a relationship between God and human beings. The healing and sanctifying qualities of grace are not to be understood with the mentality of a pragmatic consumer, explains Hahn. as if God gives us graces that we have something to give other people, so that we have something to give other people. Instead, God, states Hahn, gives them to me because he loves me, and this love, this intimacy, this friendship is what faith establishes. Before healing the blind man, Jesus restores the life of a ruler's daughter. When Jesus tells the mourners to depart, for the girl is not dead but sleeping, he is ridiculed, but then Jesus raises the girl to life. In so doing, comments Hahn, Jesus subtly distinguishes between physical death and spiritual death. For those who die in the state of sanctifying grace, in a state of friendship with God, physical death is like sleep that one wakes up from. If, though, one dies physically and spiritually, there's no waking up, for one is passed into the eternal death of the damned, which is what Jesus came principally to save us from. Chapter 9's concluding verse serves as a bridge to the next chapter, in which Jesus calls 12 of his disciples and sends them out as the 12 apostles. The concluding verse of chapter 9 is also a vocation sent by God. The harvest is plentiful, but the labors are few. Pray therefore the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his vineyard. And commenting on the significance that it is the Lord who chooses who to send as laborers in his vineyard, Benedict XVI writes, "We cannot simply pick the laborers in God's harvest in the same way that an employer seeks his employees. God must always be asked for them, and he himself must choose them for this service." This theological character is reinforced in Mark's phrase, Jesus called to him those whom he desired.